Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Hot Politics Lab. We took a well-deserved holiday, and we're all well-rested to advance to what at the University of Amsterdam we call the second block of the first semester. And we're happy to have our returning event, the Graduate Friday, again, with two speakers today, Isabella Rebasso and Neil Fasching. And Bert, as you can see, is currently absent, but he will join us shortly, so he can do the Q&A. That's great, thank you. We're going to start with Isabella Rebasso. I guess most of you know her by now. She's a PhD student at the Hot Politics Lab at the Department of Political Science in Amsterdam. And she's working on the topic of emotional framing. And she will present a pre-analysis plan of, let's say, the second paper, roughly, of her dissertation. And as usual on Graduate Fridays, there will be presentations of about 10 minutes. They're immediately followed by Q&A. So feel free, if you have a question, type it into the Q&A box once you have it, and then we'll moderate it once Isabella is done. And after Isabella did the presentation, the Q&A will move to Neil. Okay, without further ado, I want to yield the floor to Isabella.
Thanks, guys. Let me just share my screen. Right. Hi, everybody. I'll be presenting, as Gijs said, the second paper of my dissertation, which is an extension, or partly a loose replication of the first study and an extension of the first study. So I'll give a brief recap of the first study that we've done, and then I'll talk about what the extensions for the second study or what the extensions are. And I'm quite interested in whether you think these are kind of the logical next steps, or whether you think these kind of lead to other next steps and extensions that I haven't covered in this pre-analysis plan. So I'll keep the introduction very short. I also have to speak really quickly because I'm very short on time. And so basically, we know that anger and anxiety influence political behavior. Anger mobilizes, both influence information processing. But what we know less about is what the causes are of political emotions, so emotions about politics. A lot of the work that has been done has looked at or has done observational work, so the correlations between, for example, anxiety and information seeking, or it has induced these emotions experimentally, but then on purpose, these emotions that were induced were often non-political, for example, using memory recollection tasks. And these things, of course, tell us a lot about the causal role of emotions on political behaviors, but they don't tell us as much about the causes of these emotions. So this is broadly what my project is about. And in the last paper already, we designed emotion frames. So we basically were interested in how different frame characteristics and basically the way that we discuss an issue influence the emotional responses that people have to the issue. And for this, we used cognitive appraisal theory, arguing that certainty about the causes and consequences of an event increase anger and decrease anxiety, that a sense of control over an issue increases anger, and a sense of no control or situational control increases fear, and that when a responsible actor is named and so responsibility is attributed, that increases anger. And we didn't expect an effect on fear. And we tested this on 5 different issues that were not very salient, except for the one that is in bold, that parties had not really taken positions on and that were not clearly ideologically left or right. For the issue of refugees at the European border, we did write it in a way that it could come from or it could be interpreted as left-wing or right-wing, basically just criticizing a lack of EU response, but didn't say what these EU policies could be. And we tested this on a representative sample of the Dutch population with the surveying company Denata in June. The stimulus that we had for the first study looked like this. So we always had an introduction question that was, for example, what are the consequences for certainty? What is this preventable for control, and who is responsible for responsibility? And then a manipulation that was either high certainty or low certainty, and so on. And then we had a title and a base sentence that were constant across all manipulations. And what we found was very quickly that basically anger was driven by responsibility attribution. So if a responsible actor was named, people were more angry. The exception of this was the refugees issue, where we found that certainty actually increased anger, and as you'll see later, it also increased anxiety. So what's possible is that here certainty increases emotions that people already have, but we were not able to manipulate responsibility anymore, which could be because it's more salient and people already have these ideas. But on the other issues, it's very consistent that responsibility increases anger. And for anxiety, we found the opposite. So we again didn't find any effects for certainty and control, or no consistent effects. We found, as I said, the positive effect of certainty in the refugees issue, and otherwise on 3 of the 5 issues, we found a negative effect of responsibility. So if no responsible actor was named, people were more likely to report feeling anxious. Right. So what we concluded from this was that to some extent emotion frames do work, and the way that we talk about an issue does matter for emotional responses, but that anger and anxiety seem to be driven almost exclusively by responsibility attribution. Now, in the second study, I want to do 2 things. I first want to replicate these findings, but make some improvements to the research design, and then extend the kind of test of the dominant role of responsibility that I found in the first study. So about improvements of the research design, as often when you run a study, just when it's too late, you realize that there were some things that you would have done differently. The one thing that I did was I did not randomize the order of the appraisal dimensions. So they were always presented as certainty, control, and responsibility. And the issue with that could be that the last appraisal dimension might just weigh more heavily than the other ones. And there's a particular problem with control and responsibility, because it's possible that I can say this was not preventable and is not in human control, but then once I say someone is responsible, that this overrides basically the appraisal of control. So this is a problem that maybe could have led to the null findings of certainty and control, and kind of the very strong findings of responsibility. And then the second thing is the operationalization of certainty and control. So with certainty, I focused on the consequences, so it was prospective, but then it often just didn't really include that much information now that I look at it. So for example, saying we know that this will have consequences is very vague. So maybe it just needs a bit more information here. And for control, I focused on preventability, so retrospective control, but control also has an aspect of prospective control, so can we still change this? And then about the extensions, as I said, I want to test more closely this dominant role of responsibility, and I want to do this in 2 ways. One is a selection task, so do people also seek out information on this appraisal more? And the second one is, do they pay more attention to this information? So I've basically already covered this, right? So more information for certainty and prospective control. And then there's another aspect of control that I didn't take into consideration in the first study, and that is a sense of power to change the situation. So it's not just about whether technically it was preventable, but having kind of a sense that I could have prevented it. And in politics, I would argue that this is not so much about an individual sense to change something, but a collective sense of power. So briefly, how I want to do this with certainty, just very briefly, I've just added a little bit more information. So for example, here is the issue of the pesticide solution of Dutch rivers. So I've just added a bit more information on, for example, researchers have detected this pesticide pollution all across the Netherlands, and they warn that this will have consequences for public health and nature. And in low, I say basically they don't know where or where drinking water is still safe. And it's unclear what the consequences will be. With control, I changed a little bit more. So we have this, we can still reverse the pollution versus it's difficult to reverse for the prospective. Can we still change something about it? And then the kind of collective sense of power, I've now tried to manipulate as this, you know, if you believe this is a problem, you're not alone. Local groups have been forming, and particularly many Dutch citizens are ready to tackle this issue. Whereas in the low control condition, it says basically no one is aware of this, and if you care about this, good luck, because no one else does. And the experimental setup is very similar to the other one, with one big difference. So we first measure background variables and control variables in Qualtrics, and then we show the stimulus. And here we split the sample in half, and one gets forced exposure. So this is exactly the same setup as in the past one. They just get one of the manipulations, either high or low. And then the second one, they get an information board, and they can select which information they want to see. So do they want to see responsibility, certainty, control, and there obviously has to be a time limit. So I hope to then be able to see what they select first is most important to them. And then I'm interested in 3 outcomes. One is the emotional responses. They'll be measured in the same way as in the past study. So people select an emotion that they felt, and then they select the intensity of that emotion. And then in the selection task, I'm interested in the order of the appraisals that are selected. And for attention, so relative attention of responsibility versus the other 2 appraisals, I'm interested in reading time. And then also I want to compare the results of the forest exposure and the selection task. And I'll talk a little bit about 2 different options there later. And I expect the same thing as in the first study. I expect certainty control, oh, this is all shifted. Certainty control and responsibility to increase anger, and certainty and control to decrease anxiety. We didn't find any mutually reinforcing effects, so I've now left these out for now. And then on the relative importance of responsibility versus the other appraisals, I expect that information on responsibility is more likely to be selected first than information on certainty and control, and that participants view information on responsibility for longer than information on certainty or control. The selection task, obviously I can only look at the half of the sample that got the selection task. For the attention task, for the attention measure, the reading time, I can look at the whole sample. So what are the next steps? I have to pre-test again the stimuli, especially if I'm interested in reading times. I have to make sure that they are equal in length and complexity. And then also I'm interested in whether they are equal in argument strength, especially with certainty, where I was concerned that this has less information than the other appraisals. And then I need to check whether it manipulates the appraisal that it should manipulate. I have to program this selection task in Qualtrics and then pre-register, and then I'm good to go. But a few things are still open, and I'm still thinking about them. So very happy to hear your thoughts on this. The first one is about the selection task. So there's basically 2 options to do this. One, they select a headline. So for example, they select what do we know, or what can we do, or who is responsible. And then behind that is a manipulation. Or the second option is that I allow them to select either high or low appraisals. So for example, for certainty, this could look like this. I could say what we know and what don't we know. And this also has consequences for what I would expect for the differences in effects. So if they can select into high and low appraisals, I would expect the effects to be stronger. If they don't select into them, I would basically expect them to be the same, but the selection task would just give me a measure of what information people seek and which appraisals are important to them. And then about the selection task and the reading time, basically are these good measures for the relative importance of appraisal, of responsibility appraisals? And then finally, programming the selection task in Qualtrics. If there are any tips or experiences in the audience, or if you know someone who has done something similar, I'm very happy to hear tips or do's and don'ts, etc. And that's it. A little bit over time, but I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thanks, Isabella. And maybe you can put up the screen with the questions for people.
Right, yeah.
Thanks. And welcome to Bertu. Nice haircut, right? Okay, so if you have any questions or comments, advice that you want to give Isabella, please type your questions into the Q&A box. Those are the two little balloons on the bottom of your screen in the middle. And then we will read out your questions. While we're waiting for the first one to appear, maybe just start with a silly question from my side. But if we look at reading time, how can we tell the difference between someone who started to do something else and is really thinking about something?
Yeah, that's a good question. I have to think about a cutoff and maybe look at work that has used reading time as a proxy for attention and see where they have drawn the cutoff. Because of course, some people might just not read it and click through it. And some people might wander off and do something else. So there are definitely, on both sides, there needs to be a cutoff. And then also what I didn't specify here, what I have to think about still is what to use as a baseline. So how, because there's differences in how quickly people read.
Yeah.
So it would have to be the difference from the average. So for each respondent, the difference of the average reading times or something for all appraisals.
Yeah, I think in Qualtrics there's also something you could at least look at how many clicks people have done, and yeah, thinking maybe there might even be something like mouse movement or so, because someone who's gone away will not move his or her mouse at all, right? So yeah, I don't know, but yeah, there are different options here.
Yeah.
I have a question. This is asked in the chat box, so please write it into the Q&A box, not the chat box. The question is from Lala Muradova. How about merging the reading time variable with a manipulation check, which asks specific questions about the text?
Yeah, I've thought about this. I haven't, well, because I haven't thought it through enough, and also for it, in the interest of time, I haven't discussed it here. I would like to use a manipulation check, also to check whether people do then appraise these issues differently. And yeah, that could be done. Then it would have to be, so it would have to be a fact, like a recall question, right, of facts that were in the appraisal dimension. And then that could be conflated by whether people believed it, but I could add another question on that. So the problem with appraisals is that it's not necessarily about facts, it's about a sense of responsibility, it's about a sense of control. So I wonder if in a manipulation check, I could really capture that with factual questions. Because they might recall what I said in the manipulation, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I successfully elicited this sense of, for example, collective power over an issue.
You could even see the recalling of information as an additional treatment that people select themselves into, right? By recalling the responsibility, they will make that appraisal stronger. Yeah. Okay, there's a question from Nicholas Lowett. I may have missed it, but would it help to be very explicit about assigning responsibility? For instance, X farming company has been caught dumping waste into Dutch rivers.
Yes, so I didn't speak about the responsibility because it's a simpler manipulation, and I didn't change it from the first study, but that's basically how we manipulate responsibility in the first study. So with the pollution, and indeed it was like responsibility was assigned to farmers. I have also been thinking about making them more explicitly political. So here about the EU, which is basically not been able to, or has refused to pass any laws on the use of pesticides. But basically that is what we do, is in the responsibility manipulation, high responsibility, we make it very explicit. So it's really impossible to miss. And then in the ambiguous responsibility, we basically say it's a really complicated issue. It's very unclear who is responsible. That's how we manipulated that. Yeah.
Okay. We're moving to a question from Haley Kelsall. Thanks, Isabella. I really need to see how this is developing. I wonder if you measure importance of responsibility through attention/reading time. Is it necessarily the case that this would be greater than the others? If indeed responsibility attribution is the most important, could it not be also that this is faster, since the important responsibility attribution is present, or for that matter not present, whereas this was missing from the others? Not sure, but wonder if you could share your thoughts on this.
Yeah, that's exactly why I asked the question that is up on the slide, whether this is a good measure, because this is a concern that I had too. If this is a simpler appraisal that people, that is maybe more intuitive, they might also make it faster. So, and it's a kind of a simpler manipulation, as I've just said as well. So it might just be simpler information to process, and they just look for the actor and they're done. So yeah, that 100% is a concern.
Okay. Question from Micah Homan then. Hi, Isabella, interesting project. I just have some clarification questions. Are you going to conduct this study online again? I think the answer is yes.
The answer is yes. Yeah.
Maybe if you would do a lab study, you could use eye tracking to measure attention. And are you going to use different issues again, salient and less salient topics?
Yeah, so I agree. I would have preferred to do an eye tracking study, but for obvious reasons, that's not possible. Or maybe in Amsterdam it would be, but I'm not in Amsterdam right now. So hopefully I'll be able, like I'll use this as a first test, and then I'll be able to do this in the lab and measure attention a little bit better because of the concerns that I've just expressed about this measure of attention of the reading time. And what was, about the issues, right. So I plan to use the same issues more or less, so I can really see whether this reconceptualization of certainty and control makes a difference. If I use other issues, as we've seen, it's very robust across the 4 issues, but then not the refugees issue. But there is a risk if I take completely different issues, that if I find something different, I won't know if it's something about the issue or if it's really my changed manipulations. And that is something I do care about in kind of getting closer to how these emotion frames work or could work. So that's one part. I am thinking about the COVID issue because I think that is an interesting one, because it has become a lot more politicized since June. So I think that could be an interesting one. And the last meeting that we had, Heisenberg, I said I wanted to use this for a different exploratory part. But now actually I'm thinking maybe I'll just do it again and see if now it behaves like the refugees issue, which could be a good indication that it is about kind of the salience, and that is why the refugees issue was different from the other ones in June. But other than that, I think I want to use, so I'm just unsure about the COVID issue, what to do with that. If I should test that again and see if it's different now, that people have a clearer idea of who is responsible than they did in June.
Yeah. There's currently no question. So let me let me ask you another question. What do you think would happen if we would do these selection tasks and we would introduce much more highly salient issues? How would that sort of change people's behavior in this setup?
I think with very salient issues, it's difficult because they might not select the things that they already have an idea about. So if they already have an idea of who is responsible, they might not look at this. Or they might, so there might be some. It depends on how much information we give in the headlines. I think that is one of the reasons why I want to keep the headlines quite vague, because I don't want it to be kind of distorted by some confirmation bias that people click on what they already believe. So I do want to keep it quite vague, but yeah, and then so actually then I think maybe it wouldn't, I think there is a risk that they wouldn't select things that they already have an idea about, but they wouldn't really know what's behind it. So they might still be curious. And then there might be some motivated reasoning going on once they see the information and they don't believe it. But I don't think it should affect the selection itself.
Thinking about this, did you think of monitoring the reading time, the selection time? How long they take to make a selection?
I haven't thought about this, but yeah, I could. But I wonder what that would tell us exactly. I don't know.
There's a question from, let's see, Matthijs, and a question from Bert, and we're also running a bit out of time. So quick questions, quick answers. Matthijs, when do you think this second experiment will be in the field? If you would field it before or in March, COVID-19 might be very interesting. But we will also have general elections in March.
Hopefully before March.
Yeah.
Hopefully very soon.
Okay. Bert?
Yeah, thanks. I agree that we should probably not only do this before March. So how, rephrase the question. Some of this work that is used, these selection tasks, has been used to show that the treatment effects are actually under the overestimation in forced exposure compared to selection. Mm-hmm. Is that what you expect for responsibility, the strongest effect in your previous study, that it's actually because of the, once we select in, that the treatment effect becomes weaker? Or do we expect something different?
So it kind of depends on whether you expect people to avoid information that makes them emotional or seek out information that makes them emotional. And that might be an individual difference, whether they do so. And there might also be a difference between emotions, now that I think about it. So it might be that anxious people would avoid information. No, actually, no, they don't. Sorry. They maybe wouldn't. Yeah, I don't. So it is possible that that it leads to an overestimation. In this particular case, I'm not 100% sure. I think it depends on what other, if there's other information. Now in the current setup, they really only have these appraisals to choose from. So it's mostly about the selection order. I think if I added other things, then it would be a more realistic environment where they can select all types of information. And they might not always select the responsibility one. I think if the task is really to make sense of the issue, I would expect them to select responsibility as it kind of being the thing that shapes where they fall kind of on the emotional spectrum on this issue more. So it kind of, so with the, if the appraisals are manipulated behind the headline randomly, I wouldn't necessarily expect a difference. If they can select into high or low appraisals, I would, based on the work that we know of anxiety by Albert and Guderian, I would expect that it increases, so that anxiety responses are more intense because people are already feeling anxious. They select information that will make them even more anxious. So they might select information of what don't we know. They might be more likely to select the anxiety appraisals.
Okay. Okay, thanks a lot, Isabella, and thanks for the presentation. I think we're all looking forward to the results, and I think I hope maybe the next Graduate Friday that you are available, we can see them. Let's go to the second speaker for today, Neil Fasching. Neil is my research assistant. I've been torturing him for the last few months with trying to make sense of our physiology data, and particularly the 1980s software that goes with it. Neil is also a student in the Research Master in Communication Science at the Amsterdam School of Communication Research, and currently writing his thesis, right, with Bert, and that's what you will be presenting, right? No, it's not a thesis. It's an internship, or just a fun project.
It's just a project. It's
just a fun project. It's like weekends. I'm bored. Let's look at childhood personality.
Exactly.
Okay, Neil. Same drill for you.
Great.
Yield the floor to you.
Let me share my screen 1 second. Okay. Sorry about the distracting curtains behind me. Hopefully we can get past that. Okay, so I'm doing a project on childhood personality and ideology using evidence from 2 different conceptual replications, 2 longitudinal studies based in the UK. And basically, my question is going to be how best to back up these findings. I'm going to be trying to publish null findings, and so anything about additional robustness checks or anything like that that could help back up the results would be greatly appreciated. Okay, so the association between ideology and personality. So psychologists and political scientists have long been drawn to understanding the association between personality and political ideology. A dominant perspective is that there's meaningful left and right differences that may be rooted in basic personality dispositions. These could be due to differences in psychological needs, motivation, orientation towards the world, etc. For example, past research has found conservatives are more respectful of authority, less open to experience, and less tolerant of ambiguity. However, while most of these studies have connected concurrent or subsequent behavior to ideology, the nature of these studies do not really allow researchers to disentangle whether personality is indeed causing ideology. Did I go past? Yeah. Okay, cool. So there's 2 previous studies that I'm going to basically be working off of. The first one's Block and Block that looked to investigate the developmental roots of ideology before individuals became political beings. They looked at 95 children at the age of 3 and 4, and then they looked at ideology 20 years later. They did correlations at the p-value of 0.1. And basically, they argue based off these correlations that they found that conservatives of both genders were characterized as being psychologically unflattering, such as being anxious, fearful. So a second study was done a few years later that used many more participants, 650 kids, but they only looked at 4 different things: restlessness, shyness, attentional focusing. Sorry, this is blocking it. And fear. So this was at age 4.5, and then they looked at ideology at 18. Basically, they found children that had difficulty paying attention, were less restless, and had higher levels of fearfulness at 54 months were more likely to be conservative at 18. These results were largely consistent with block and block. The only main difference was that they didn't find liberals to be more restless as children. Perfect. So the present study. I'm going to be using two. I think I just skipped something. I am sorry. Causal link, there it is. Sorry about that. So there's reasons to question this causal link. I think. Okay. Well-powered studies that had looked at evidence of conservatives and liberals differing were not able to be replicated. Cross-sectional studies that looked at childhood and ideology also show that it's already kind of weak. So we shouldn't really expect there to be association between childhood personality and ideology, or at least not for it to be as strong. And lastly, childhood personality is in and of itself not a very strong predictor of adult personality. And from the previous two studies, there's some questions raised about ideology being measured at the age of like 18 or 20, and also the sample size of these. So for the present study, I'm going to be using two different data sets from the UK, two quite large data sets that are longitudinal studies. The first one is the 1958 National Child Development Study. I'm using this more of the exploratory analysis. Overall, there was 9,220 students or kids at the age of 7 and 8,756 at the age of 11. And then ideology was measured at the age of 42, so much later. And it was measured using 8 different policy questions, and we'll get to those in a second. And then the other data set that I used was from the 1970 British cohort study. So this one, based off the exploratory analysis of the NCDS, this one was pre-registered. Like the NCDS, it also measured personality at 2 different ages, at age 5 and at age 10. But once again, it looked at ideology at age 42 with 8 personality questions, policy questions, excuse me. So the present study. So for the child personality traits, there was, you can see on the left all of the ones that are listed. These were measured by the parents, usually the mother of the kids. They were basically the same questions across the 2 different studies. The only difference was restlessness wasn't asked in the NCDS and it was asked in the BC. 70, so that was included just for that one. In terms of ideology, it was pretty much the same, just differences in wording mostly. For social, there's 5 different questions about support for death penalty, abortion, your respective traditional values, your willingness to tackle environmental problems, and whether lawbreakers deserve stiffer penalties. For adult ideology, there's 3 questions for economic side of things, and that would be that the government should redistribute income, big businesses benefit owners over the workers, and ordinary people do not receive the fair share of the nation's wealth. So unlike the previous, or at least of block and block that only use correlations, I wanted to use more rigorous statistics, I guess, and so I focused on doing regressions. So on the right side, we've got the overall conservatism on the, on both of them, but on the right, it's the NCDS, and for the left is my the pre-registered BCS 70. Basically, at least looking on the right, we see that there's no consistent relationship between a childhood personality and adult conservatism. None of the 8 personality traits measured at age 7 correlated with adult conservatism, and only 2 of the 8 measured at age 11 predicted adult ideology, those being childhood solitude and childhood irritability. However, the effects were in the wrong directions. Liberals, not conservatives, were more solitary and irritable at 11, not conservatives. And then turning to the pre-registered on the left, again, only 2 of the 9 personality traits measured at 7 were associated with adult ideology. childhood restlessness was positively but weakly associated with conservatism in adulthood. But childhood solitude, contrary to what we expected, was negatively associated with conservatism. Basically summing up the overall conservatism, only 6 of the 34 measures of childhood personality traits had a statistically significant association with conservatism, and 4 of these 6 were actually in the wrong direction. And I also just want to point out the effect sizes right here. Our dependent variable was measured from 0 to 1. So effect size of 0.02, 0.04 is quite small. So I also wanted to break up conservatism or ideology more generally into social ideology and economic ideology. And so, next slide. So I also did coefficient plots for this as well. On the right, again, we've got the NCDS. 6 of the 8 personality traits did not show statistically significant and positive associations. Childhood willingness to fight was positively associated, but it was also very weakly associated with social conservatism. Looking at the pre-registered one, we find neither childhood willingness to fight nor childhood worry were associated with social ideology in both waves, while they were for the NCDS. So it kind of shows you that depending on which one you look at, the results are different. But once again, just like taking it all together, we find that only 10 of the 34 measures of childhood personality traits had a statistically significant association with social conservatism, and only 5 of those were in the direction that we expected. And then also for economic ideology, once again, looking at the right side, the NCDS, only 2 of the personality traits were linked to economic ideology in both waves, solitude and willingness to fight. But again, wrong direction. They were negatively associated with economic conservatism. The only childhood personality that was linked to economic conservatism in both waves of the BCS70 was childhood disobedience. All total, again, only 11 of the 34 measures of childhood personality traits were associated with economic conservatism. And all but one of them were actually in the wrong direction as well. So this is just the whole plot altogether. It just kind of helps you visualize the effects, or the really small effects, or the non-effects, however you want to take it. Basically, you can just see that everything's hovering around the coefficient estimate of 0. And then even if it is statistically significant, it's often a very, very, very small effect size. The big things here also, some things are, like I had mentioned quite a few times, are in the opposite direction. So things like disobedience and solitude predicted liberalism, not conservatism, which is quite different than not only what we expected, but what past studies have found. So publishing no findings is hard. So to try to get over that, we did quite a few different robustness checks. We did correlation matrices like block and block did. I changed the dependent variable. Instead of being political conservatism, I changed it to political extremity. So instead of looking at your ideology, just more looking at if these personality traits predicted whether you were more extreme, regardless if you're liberal or conservative. Also looked at regressions using just each political issue instead of collapsing all 8 or the 5 and 3, but just looking at each issue. I also, for the National Child Development Study, they had, instead of asking the parents to rate the kids, they also had one where they asked the teachers to rate the kids, which is closer to the previous studies. But also, they had very similar questions that were scaled on a very similar scale. But overall, the results look very much the same, of just no findings. And lastly, we've also done a Bayesian analysis to try to prove the no findings. But that's basically where I'm at right now. Anything stands out is that something that I missed, or an additional robustness check that I could perform, or anything else just to help back up these results would be great. Overall, I do want to say that this study is focused on childhood personality. It does not speak to the link of ideology and concurrent and subsequent behavior. But with all of that said, it seems likely that the link between childhood personality and adult ideology is not as strong, at least as it has previously been found to be. As I discussed, the insignificant results, the relationships in the wrong direction, and the small effect sizes. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. And I also want to compliment you on an excellent presentation. This is great, and you're among the students that have really stood out for me in the last years. And you've been working with Gijs in the lab, doing some stuff on questionable research practices with Jif Lelkes, and then you're also working on this. And besides that, you're also completing some courses with excellent grades. So my compliments. There's already a question from Mark Brandt, somebody who knows this literature well. And Mark has a question for you. Can you explain why it's unexpected for disobedience to predict liberalism? Under the assumption that conservatives are more authoritarian, wouldn't we expect to be more obedient and liberals to be more disobedient?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think a lot of going through the different studies and the different findings, there's also some, it's not always the same depending from one study to another study. So the reason why I had all of the childhood personalities predicting conservatism, social or economic, was based off of the two previous studies that I was trying to replicate. Most specifically being the block and block one. They talk about just all of negative personalities at childhood being associated with adult conservatism. So just along those lines, we just kind of thought to follow everything with predicting adult conservatism. That's a fair point that was just made. Other things that I've also heard about is like restlessness. Restlessness, some studies have found predicts liberalism and not conservatism. So, I could have switched around the hypothesis too, but just to be kind of consistent and to be able to talk to the two studies I'm trying to conceptually replicate, I just kind of had them all predicting conservatism.
Yeah, that Mark also responds. Thanks, that all makes sense. Please, if you have questions for Neil or also ideas of where, Gijs has a question. Yeah, and he has the right to speak.
Really awesome work. Very promising, I think, and I don't think this will be too hard to publish. Of course, you do have to fight against a couple of people here, but I think the results are pretty convincing. One minor thing, and maybe you've already done that, but I would actually be interested in sort of getting a feel for the average effect in the other research that you've discussed in your literature review, right?
Yeah.
I think and typically people do a little bit their best to make effect sizes look nice, but if you think a little bit longer about them, they are often already quite small as you actually present them. But that's just a suggestion. But my question is a bit different, and that's we kind of assume. I mean, so maybe the problem here is that personality isn't stable, but that's typically what personality psychologists want to talk about. But maybe the other problem is that ideology isn't stable, and I'm not sure exactly when were people asked. Okay, so these are different cohorts. So people were asked about their ideology at different times, right? Or not?
No, so it was just they were asked at the age of 42, basically all of these 8 policy questions. So I did go back because it was, quite a few different waves, and I looked around the age of 18 and around age 20, because at least that I could then kind of much more conceptually replicate Block and Block and the Fraley et al. Papers, because that's kind of around the time that was also, they were measuring it, but there weren't any questions like that. So the only kind of snapshot in time I have of these people's political interests is at age 42.
Yeah. So look, this is not something you can do in your study, because you can't have variation in ideology, but the differences in findings across studies may be due to the fact that ideology itself is changing in these different contexts or not. So maybe it changed in your context, but not in the other context. It's something we can't really exclude.
Yeah, most definitely.
Okay, yeah, and then Mark Plant, for those interested, also posted a paper in the chat showing some panel data from New Zealand from Chris Sipley and Danny Osborne's team, where they look at personality and ideology in adulthood over multiple waves, and they find basically that there's no evidence that personality changes are predicting changes in subsequent ideology. That's worth a read. Question, Neil, from Tobias Rohrbach. Superflow robustness checks. I find the Bayesian analysis particularly interesting in this case. Could you elaborate on the strategy here? It might be helpful to calculate and compare the Bayes factor or your reference studies within your own.
I can't talk too much of it at this point. It is currently being updated and done. We initially, we had just done it for the NCDS, and then when we were doing exploratory, and it hasn't yet been done to include the British cohort study. And I don't, can't think of any of the numbers off the top of my head. It's just deep in my code somewhere right now. Sorry about
that. From a question from Noon Abdul Qadir from the Communication Science Department. In the robustness checks, is there a reason for using political extremism rather than just leaning? Proving an extreme position may require arbitrary cutoff. So what's the reason to look at extremity?
It was just another, I'm trying to think of, and I know you probably remember his name, Barrett, the researcher who brought up extremity for a lot of reasons. Do you remember his name?
Well, among others, there has been some people, Mark among others, Mark Brandt have raised the point that it might be extremity rather than asymmetry.
Yeah, exactly. And I just kind of wanted to look at, I was trying to find different ways to look at this data, and for extremity, it was just many people were, when I plotted the ideology, whether social, general, or economic, it was very nicely distributed. So I was also just really curious about the people at the end. So it was just a way to kind of just see if, instead of ideology, if it was something else that personality may be influencing. Right,
yeah. Suggestion from Mark. This is all nice, and Mark has a suggestion along the lines like, if you have personality at two waves, it'd be nice to know what the test retest is, and then compare the size of the test retest to the size of the personality ideology coefficient. Presumably, personality ideology won't surpass the test retest, and so test retest provides some sort of benchmark. I think this is an interesting point, Neil, to take in.
Yeah, most definitely. I'm writing it down right now. No, I think that's great.
Yeah, maybe something like using the list panel, you could actually do this. That has repeated measures of both ideology and personality.
Yeah, most definitely. That's wonderful.
Questions from Matthijs. Thanks, Neil. This is very interesting. Well done. Could you tell us more about two things? I'll read them out one at a time. The correlation between childhood personality and adult personality. Can you assess that with these data, or has this been done in other studies?
It has been done in other studies, and I also did do it in this study. Kind of when I was talking about from the theory section, I was talking more about just results that other people have published to go to, but I actually did in this study itself look at personality predicting. So both, basically I looked at all of the 9 different child behaviors, and I looked at if they correlated to the Big Five, because the Big Five was asked I believe, like in your early 20s and also in your mid 30s. And the correlations were just quite low across the board between looking at the childhood to adult, and then even comparing the big five at the age of 20 to whatever it was at 30 was also not very strong. So my big takeaway was, if even within this own sample, is if personality then is not correlated with personality just a little bit later, why would we think, you know, childhood personality would be linked to ideology? So yeah, both looked at in this study, and also was referring to other people's studies.
Second question from Matthijs. What does the literature say about the role of the family of the child? The correlation between childhood personality and ideology could theoretically, of course, also be due to socialization. Yeah,
that's a great question. So in actually the second of the two papers that I'm conceptually replicating, the Fraley et al. Paper, they actually had two different studies within this paper. One is the personality, and that's the one I'm speaking towards. But they also, the second part of it was the parental rearing strategies. So whether they were like authoritarian parents, whether they used what was it, corporal punishment and stuff like that. And the results seem quite a bit stronger than personality. So it definitely seemed like that you know, child rearing, your family, has much more going on than maybe just personality itself does. But at least looking through the data, I didn't see any way to uncover that within the data I have myself.
So hitting your children matters.
Apparently, yeah. Hitting your children matters. Yelling at your children matters. Yeah, they seem to be more conservative, but that's, once again, that's the Fraley et al. Paper that you know, might have been underpowered too as well. And while the effect sizes were bigger than they were for personality, it wasn't like they were big effect sizes. They're still quite small. They were just bigger than personality.
Yes. Thanks, Neil. We're approaching 4 o'clock, and I want to once more give you a big compliment for doing this work. I agree with Gijs that I think this should and I think also will be published. I think there's right now I obviously have a stake partly in this agenda, but I think there's a more critical assessment of this literature that. Whether or not there is evidence for ideological asymmetry, and there's actually quite some evidence accumulating that maybe these, aside from cross-sectional correlations, there's not that much evidence there yet. So I think we're definitely gonna try to help you to get this out. That said, thank you. Thank you for this presentation. We're approaching the end of the lab. Next week we have Jen Jarrett, who just moved to Dartmouth, and we'll talk about the effects of a study on misinformation. There's actually a paper going to be available. If you're not on our mailing list, just send an email to Mike, who can distribute the paper to you. The week after, we have Ashley Jardina, who will talk about white identity politics. And then the week after, we have Ursula Hess on facial mimicry. So a diverse set of excellent speakers in the coming weeks. So definitely stay around, join in, tune in, listen to us, watch us, and we'll be back next week. Thanks a lot.
Thanks,